Welcome back to Chapter 11. In this video, we're talking about the different properties and values of styling text. I will go ahead and say that this video will be quite long, so if you need to pause it and review things, please do so because that is the purpose of a video. First off, let's talk about font properties and what a typeface is. A typeface is a glyph design. A glyph includes letters, numbers, symbols, and other characters. For example, Arial, Algerian, and Impact are all different typefaces. You may consider these to be different fonts, but technically a typeface has different fonts inside of it, which is what we're talking about next. A font is a collection of characteristics including typeface, which we just talked about, size, weight, style, and other items that are properties of that font. For example, if you've ever dealt with pretty much any Word document, you've had the different option of choosing Arial as your font. But as you choose Arial, you may have the option to select Arial Narrow, Arial Narrow Italic, Arial Bold, Arial Black. All of these different typefaces are part of one font. Next, we're talking about including the actual element of a font in your CSS. Inside the property and values, you're going to be using the property font family, that is font family with a dash in between the two words. This defines which typeface to use. The best practice is to provide at least 3 different fonts, including a fallback font. The reason for this fallback font is because not all computers may have or load the font you pick. Fallback fonts such as sans serif and serif are installed on 99% of computers. Therefore, in case the person viewing your site can't load Verdana or Arial, the fallback font of sans serif should be loaded on their machine, and therefore they should be able to load the font you're going to choose. Not specifically the font you want to load, but at least you have a fallback font for them to see the content. A few font family typeface categories are serif, which include finishing strokes, flared or tapered endings such as Times, Georgia, Platino Linotype. You also have sans serif, which are basically plain strokes, such as Arial, Verdana, Impact, and Tahoma. You have monospace, which allows for fixed characters like a typewriter. You have Courier and Monaco as examples. Fantasy includes decorative and playful fonts like Papyrus, Harrington, or Curls MT. And lastly, you have cursive, which looks more like handwritten fonts, such as Bruscript MT and Lucida handwriting. All of these are good examples of fallback fonts. As long as you include one of these 5, chances are those will be installed on pretty much any computer you work with, and therefore, if your font can't be loaded, this is a good fallback. To give you a good idea about the difference between serif and sans serif, as most people don't really understand the difference, serif includes the flared or tapered edges, such as a Times New Roman font. Sans serif basically means without, and serif, of course, as we see in the example, is the flares. So you can see the example on the right, which is basically a standard Arial font, is just the plain text by itself, whereas the serif includes the same concept but with more tapered edges. Next we have font size, which includes units of measurement. You have px or pixels, the percent sign for percent, em, which is basically allows for scalable percents, rem, which is the same as em but less problems as it is the root element, and VW or VH, which allows for viewport width or viewport height. Font properties allow for font size, allowing for pixels which most browsers display text at a 16 pixel size by default. Now, if you're not too versed in the computer language, a resolution for a monitor allows for different sizing of elements based on how high or low the resolution is. So for most browsers to display 16 pixels, that means that the text being displayed is 16 pixels high. But if you have more resolution, that means that more pixels can fit on your screen. Therefore, 16 pixels is quite tiny, versus the 10,000 that can be displayed. If you have a lower resolution, that means the same 16 pixels will be bigger because the 16 pixels take up more space out of a total of, let's just say, 100. Therefore, 16 pixels is not exactly the best font size measurement to have when scaling text. To give a good example, your H1 element allows for a roughly 200% increase. H2 is 150%, H3 is about 125, H4 is 100 or the exact value, H5 is about 85%, and H6 is about 65%. If you size everything down, for the example, your default browser setting is 16 pixels. But if you set the font size of your body to 50%, that means that it's 50% of 16 pixels, which is 8 pixels. Then, if you set the font size of your P tags to 50%, that means that 50% of 50% of 16 pixels is 4 pixels. So when you're dealing with pixels, you may not have the best representation when it comes to scaling down and scaling up your percentages. When you're dealing with EM, that basically means the value that the font is being scaled at based on how the content is viewed. For example, you have 1 EM, which is roughly the same as 100%. 0.5 EM is roughly 50, and 2 EM is 200%. This is scalable with the page and the content, making it easier to view on scalable devices such as phones. However, you also have REM, which is the same as EM, but based on the HTML sizing, or the root page sizing. For example, if you set the standard default sizing at 16 pixels, and then you set the body at 50%, that means that the font size will be set to 8 pixels. And just as before, if you set the P tag font size to 50%, that means that it will be 8 pixels as well, because it's 50% of the HTML root default. Next, we have viewport width and height. 1 VW equals 1% of the browser window width. Meanwhile, 1 VH equals 1% of the browser window height. Now, usually 3 EM is compared to about 66 characters per line. This allows for maximizing accessibility to scale with devices, but it's not supported by older browsers such as Internet Explorer 6. Some font size recommendations: you should start with the pixel sizing to get an idea of how to use it, and then migrate to others when you're comfortable. Don't go ahead and jump to the end and try to use viewport width and height if you don't understand how different things can scale. So make sure you start out with pixels so that you have a better understanding of how things are done and how things scale, and then move into the different elements to make sure you understand it. Next, let's talk about font weight. This allows you to set the boldness of text. Heading elements such as H1, H2, and H3, etc. are automatically bolded, so you don't need to bold these. This is not a replacement for strong, but a replacement for the B tag, mainly because the B tag is not semantically allowed. The values for this are bold and normal, which removes boldness. Anything else is just fine-tuning. So for this example, you have the P selector, the font weight property, and the bold value. Again, if you have something that is bold and you set the font weight to normal, then it will remove the boldness of the pre-bolded element. Next, you have font style. This allows you to set the italics of a text. Why it isn't called font italics, I don't know. Again, I didn't create HTML. This is not a replacement for EM, but it is a replacement for the I tag. Again, because the I tag is not semantically allowed, it doesn't really modify the pronunciation or the emphasis of text versus the M. The values are italic and normal, not italicize or italication or anything. It's just italic. Font style, italic. You also have normal, which removes italic if the item is already pre-stated as being italic. Font variant allows you to set the small caps of text. This is only a visual modification and doesn't actually modify the text in any representation, emphasis, or modification whatsoever. It is purely visual. The values are small caps with the dash between the two words and none, which removes the small caps. So in this example, the P selector, the font variant property, and the value is small caps. Now let's take pretty much everything we just covered and create a font shorthand. That means that instead of having 4 rules like this, such as having the font family for Arial, Helvetica, and sans serif, good fallback font, the font size is 18 pixels, a font variant is small caps, and the font weight is bold, you can actually add all that together in a font shorthand. In this case, we just say font, type the variant, weight, size, and family, hopefully in that order. This way, it makes it easier for you to type. Instead of having to check for 4 different lines and 4 different values, you just have one line with all the items listed on it. Again, this is a good example of having multiple values for one property. Other font properties, there are other things that have not been covered in this presentation, and most are obscure and you won't use them. But if you are curious about them, please visit the website on your page, which is https://developer.mozilla.org/en-us/docs/web/css/font. On that page, you'll be able to find out different font properties you can use that either we won't cover or have not covered, and you can play around with them, but keep in mind that some of them are not supported by modern browsers. Next, let's talk about text properties versus just styling. First, you have text align, which allows you to align text to the side of an element. Some of the values are left, which is by default, center, right, and justify. To give you a good example about what these look like, here are a few examples. You have left, center, right, and justify. Justify looks just like left. However, the spacing between the words is calculated so that the left and the right alignment works. It's more of square-based elements. If you've ever seen articles in newspapers, those items are justified so that it looks like it fills up more space. It's the exact same text, but it looks more somewhat professional than just left-aligned text. Next, you have text indent, which is used to indent the first line of a paragraph. You have numerical values such as px, percent, em, rem, vw or vh, and pt for point. You can have a positive or a negative value for text indent, which is good for indenting text inside something or moving something beyond the indentation space, such as the example on the right. And unless you are very, very good, you better have a reason for having a negative indent. Next is text transform. This is used to transform the text to a different case. Again, this is just a visual modification. The values are uppercase, lowercase, capitalize, and none, which is the default. In the examples, you have the uppercase, the lowercase, the capitalize, which is the first letter of a word, and then none, which basically just allows for the standard capitalization of whatever text is presented. No modification required. Next, you have text decoration. This is used to add a line to text. Again, it is just decorative. It is not a replacement for the DEL tag. Some of the values are underline, overline, strike through, and none, which is the default. So you have the underline, the overline, the strike through, and then no underline at all, which if you have a link and you want to remove the underline from the link, you would do so by using text decoration and none. There are a few good examples about why you would want to remove the underline from a link. And once you get more comfortable with it, it will become more obvious. But right now, only remove the underline from a link unless you have a good reason. Next, we have some text properties of text shadow. This is used to add shadow to text. The values are X, Y, blur, and color. To give you a good example, the top left example has 3px for the X, 3px for the Y, 2px for the blur property, and the color, which in this case is specified in a hex code, or #000. You can use the actual names of colors, such as black, or yellow, white, red, green, or pretty much any other color you would like that has a name. But in some cases, you'll also use the hex code, in which case I have done here. To go through the other examples, the one on the top right has the X and Y set to a negative value, which moves the text shadow left and up. The one on the bottom left has a 30px X value and a 0 Y value, which means that it moves to the right about 30 pixels, but it only moves 0 on the y-axis, which means that it doesn't move vertically at all. And the one on the bottom right allows for a glow effect because you're allowing the shadow to be displayed all around the letters. It's a neat little effect, but again, it is only visual. If you want to create two different items for two shadow rules, you can have the XY and blur color and then comma and then another XY blur and color. That way the items show up differently instead of just one text shadow. To give you a good example, this is one item that has two text shadow declarations, which is okay, except one overwrites the other, and therefore doesn't exactly get displayed. So you have the standard black one, and then the red one overwrites the black. So to combine the two, you would actually use a comma, and therefore you have the black and the red together. To give you a more extreme example, you can also have on the different line. To give you a more extreme example, we have this right here, which is a little beyond standard, but at least it gives you a good idea about how you can use multiple shadows to create more visual effects around letters. And this is it in a more readable fashion. Other typographical properties allow for line height. This allows for the adjustment of vertical space between lines of text. The default is about 125%. You can include numerical values such as points, pixels, percent, EM, REM, VW, VH, and even a decimal number. To give you a good example of line height 200%, that basically allows for double spacing between the paragraphs in the different lines. Line height of 1.5 EM basically means 150% of the actual scaled text. And line height 3 means that you are actually having 3 lines, including the one that it's on, between each element of text. A line height shorthand allows for you to actually include the previous font shorthand, but by modifying the actual font with a line height element or a line height value in the font size separated by a slash. It must be in the font size value because otherwise the browser may not know what you're talking about. Now we can talk about letter spacing, which is just the space between letters. You can have the same numerical values as presented before, such as 20 pixels, 2 pixels, and even negative 10 pixels, which increases or decreases the spacing between the letters. You also have word spacing, which increases or decreases the space between the words. In this case, we have 20 pixels, 1 EM, and negative 10 pixels, which kind of overwrites the two words. Next, we'll talk about color, which will be discussed much later. That's it for this video. Again, it was quite long, but hopefully you got a general understanding about all of the different stylizing properties we can use. If you have any questions about this or anything in Chapter 11, please send me an email or hit me up on Twitter, and I'll get back to you with the best possible answer.